Well, welcome to a special Loaded Mag. We've kind of run around the houses and everyone's kind of made different plans and to get on here. Some of us, in particular myself, is still struggling slightly after yesterday's England result. And I did see some pictures of Pete, so I know he's probably the same. But we wanted to do something a bit different. And midweek last week, I think it was, or certainly late last week, after a couple of beers, I sent a DM to Ben Jacobs and I said, "You wouldn't come on the show, would you?" And in fairness, he went, yeah, no problem. So we are going to have a chat with Ben. He's sitting in the green room. We're going to bring him on very, very shortly. I just want to say a couple of things before we start from a personal perspective. One, this isn't a show where we want to come at Ben with a funny angle and try and make him look bad in any way, shape or form. We want to have a fair chat. We are interested in listening to all sides and all opinions. We had George on talking about arbitration over a week ago, went down really well, and we sat and listened, and we're going to do the same with Ben, get his opinions on things. I've had people message me, as have some of the lads, to say, put this question to him, do this to him, do that, do this, and that's not what it's about, guys. There's fair sides to every discussion, so we're going to be fair. We're going to take comments and put some up where we can. We are obviously going to give Ben a good opportunity to talk as well, because I know he does like to talk. We're going to chat a bit of NUFC, but we are also going to chat a bit about Leicester, with Ben being a Leicester man, about their signings and season. We are then also going to talk, obviously, we have to, a little bit about England and the final result from last night and the final on Sunday. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest for this evening, Ben Jacobs.
Welcome, Ben.
Welcome, Ben.
Thanks
very much. No problem. Listen, we're delighted to have you on. I did say in the green room, chuffed that you even answered me DM. So yeah, look, it's really good. So I suppose to get started, I've watched a few pods you've been on. Obviously, we were part of Steve Wraith's Matters group. We kind of do our thing now. I watched John Gallagher's shots. Interesting to listen to everything. But I think it's fair to say you divide the fan base of Newcastle United in some manners. And I suppose one of the questions I wanted to put to you is, have you ever listened to yourself back and gone, okay, well, maybe because I said that, I can understand why they're firing at me on Twitter? Is it kind of, when you chat about things, do you know what you're going to talk about? Is it based on what questions you get thrown? Or do you feel that sometimes there are things there that you know might aggravate a certain half of the fan base and you don't mind that? Or is it purely, which I think is, you want to get all sides of it out there in the open?
It's a good question. And I think as a journalist, you're genuinely just trying to tell the story. And the challenge when you talk to a demographic that are specifically Newcastle United fans is that you do want to consistently underline what a great club it is, and also an element of that empathy towards the fan base, because regardless of the circumstances and whether a takeover occurs or not, there's still the whole backdrop behind the club of Mike Ashley's long tenure, of the decline on and off the field, a lack of communication, a lack of love and care towards the team, which is in stark contrast with the incredible fan base. And I think that sometimes you give an answer and people just say, well, you're pro Premier League or ultimately a Qatari stooge, which is a ridiculous thing to say to a journalist who's always going to dig around and try and give you all perspectives. And then at other times you give all perspectives and you get told that you're just sitting on the fence. And I think the fundamental irony here is that I don't start in a position where I'm trying to antagonize anyone. I don't start with an angle. I say it like I see it, based upon the information that I procure as a journalist. And I try and engage, I try and talk to the fans, I try and remain as professional as I can. But everyone's got their opinion. And I respect those that disagree with me. I respect people that believe they have contrary information. Everyone has different sources. Everybody's talking to different people. But I think the thing to underline is that when people talk to a journalist, they instantly expect a position, a yes or no, a definitive answer. And if it was all that clear and simple and positive, whether the takeover happens or not, we wouldn't be a year plus into this long drawn saga, which has ultimately left Newcastle United in limbo. And the situation we're at currently is really very simple. And even though those that are watching might be shouting and screaming and saying, hang on a minute, how did we get there? Or why are you saying that? But where we're at is very simple. It's a legal case with arbitration, or two legal cases if we're factoring in the anti-competition case, that could go either way. And we don't know which way it's going to go. So all you can do as a journalist at the moment, and we've been in different phases and positions throughout the course of the takeover. Sometimes it's looked very positive. Sometimes it's looked very negative. It's been completely off at one point. It's been back on the table at another. But where are we at now? Well, the honest truth is we don't know. It's going to play out in a legal court, maybe two legal courts, and it genuinely could go either way because the outcome of litigation isn't certain. So those telling you that Newcastle United definitely have a strong case, or those telling you the Premier League are certainly going to win, might have that implication fed to them from one side or the other, but it's just not true, because you have a hearing in the context of arbitration with a 3-person panel, and that hearing hasn't started yet. And unless it's made public, or until we get what's called an award, and if that is made public, we don't quite know where we stand. You hear a lot of whispers, but what can you do with them? You can only really analyze them. And all I'm trying to do is analyze them in the most honest, genuine, and balanced way I can. Some fans don't like it because they're pro-takeover. Other fans like it because they want balance. But I don't really think it's a reflection of me. I'm one of many who has had a target on their back. But why have I got a target on their back? It's not really that personal. It's nothing to do with me. It's just the fact that journalists are the only ones putting things in the public domain at the moment, or at least have been until Amanda Staveley and others over the course of the last few days and weeks have reiterated statements. But generally speaking, it's the journalist relaying information. So it's the journalist being attacked. But why am I being attacked? I'm being attacked because a fan either wants the takeover or doesn't, and they're at polar extremes. And if they hear something that doesn't fit into that narrative, they counter with their own opinion. And sometimes they do that in an engaging and fair way, and other times they just make it very personal.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to remember as well for me is that, you know, the NUFC fan base that is based on Twitter is a very, very small percentage of the fan base in its entirety. So, you know, some that are pro, some that are anti, and some that go completely off the blocks and, you know, are quite, you know, obscenely rude and everything else. I think it's important to remember it's only a very small minority, you know, on one platform. From a point you talked there about, obviously, you know, Amanda Staveley, and, you know, over the last couple of weeks, a lot of things have gone on. Obviously, we've had Mike and the club kind of put out the statement. And then obviously this week we've had Amanda Staveley doing her piece on Sky Sports News, and then on the Northeast, on ITV Tying Tees. Can I ask you, Ben, what did you make of Amanda's interview?
I think that it was a strange timing. That was my first reaction. And you can look at it both ways. So I'm certainly not going to discredit those that just say Newcastle United are so confident in getting a takeover, and secondary exposing the Premier League's lack of conduct, if you like, that they're quite prepared now to use any legal avenues to update the fans. And that was the key line in the letter for me and the subsequent interview to Sky Sports, that it was clear to Tracy Crouch that she was talking on behalf of the consortium, because she said this is a means through which, quote, we can update fans. So that tells you that she's not just writing because she can as an individual, she's writing on behalf of the group. That's obviously a good thing because it reaffirms something that I've said all along with other journalists, that PIF and the consortium have always remained at the table. But you do have to ask, when they've been so secretive and silent for so long, and when Mike Ashley does all of his business in private, why now, right before the hearing, both Mike Ashley through Newcastle United, as per that picture with the fists clenched, and Amanda Staveley are both so vocal? And again, the answer is either, for those that want to play into the pro takeover narrative, because Newcastle United are one, very confident in winning arbitration and getting their takeover, but two, also changing the governance of football and making the Premier League more transparent. But my own personal view is that you don't litigate traditionally through the media, especially not days or weeks before a key hearing. And even though Newcastle United fans have seemingly twisted themselves into a knot and made arbitration more complicated than it is, my understanding remains that arbitration has a specific terms of reference around separation. So providing Newcastle United win arbitration and show PIF to be legally separate from the Saudi Arabian state, then the consortium will return to the table, be tested solely as PIF, be green lighted, and a takeover will happen. And it's very noble for Staveley and Newcastle United to want to fight to make the Premier League more transparent and potentially win anti-competition cases that lead to damages and so on. But all that's longer term. It's going to take years and years and years. So you've got two narratives, and they may be intertwined, because obviously Newcastle United believe that one of the reasons why the takeover wasn't approved was due to that lack of conduct. But if we're talking about the nitty-gritty of arbitration, it's not really about conduct, which is why even if it went public, it wouldn't reveal as much as disclosure from the anti-competition case. The hearing is going to be a legal argument versus a practical reality about the role of PIF and their influence from the Saudi Arabian state. And if the Premier League win and prove that there's a link, then PIF won't return to the table because they don't want to embroil their government into the testing process. But if Newcastle United win, even though others may disagree, my understanding remains that that will allow PIF to be tested, to pass the test, and ultimately the Premier League to respect the outcome of arbitration, only test PIF. Newcastle United will have a pathway towards a takeover. So if that's the case, then there's no need for all of this noise unless it's noise out of desperation. And again, to reiterate, I do understand and respect the other side, which is Newcastle are fighting on two fronts, two cases. They're very confident. But I just don't think you litigate through the media if you're confident of winning arbitration. Now, there is a middle ground to all of this, which is perhaps because legally Staveley and Newcastle can release their perspective. It's mind games, a bit like around the panel chair as well. And Newcastle appealed the panel chair. And then after they lost that appeal, they still were able to put out information calling into question his potential bias against Newcastle United. And as a consequence, it's sort of subliminally at the back of the mind, and the panel are aware of the backstory. And it doesn't hurt Newcastle United to do exactly the same here, put something out there before a hearing, because the three panelists will obviously be aware of what's going on. Yeah. And it plays into the narrative around the hearing. So that's the middle ground. It's a sort of bullish tactic in that respect. But I think fundamentally, if Newcastle are confident of proving separation, you go and prove separation. And whether that's private or public, it's irrelevant, because if you prove the separation, you get your takeover. And that's the simplest scenario. That's the scenario the club want. That's the scenario the fans want. And then everything else about changing the governance of football, about heads rolling, about proving corruption, that can come later. But of course, the irony here is if Newcastle get their takeover and have a new ownership group, that new ownership group, not Mike Ashley, are the ones speaking on behalf of Newcastle United. And at that point, I think they drop any allegations of corruption, because Amanda Staveley has now said publicly she respects the Premier League and she wants that working relationship. And it's sort of funny to give you like a quick example of how the fan base react and then almost have to U-turn on social media, because when I said a few days back, Staveley needs a working relationship with the Premier League, I got absolutely hammered for it. And then she does an interview and a statement where she explicitly states that she loves the Premier League. She needs
to work with the Premier League, yeah.
And you're like, well, hang on a minute. That's what I told you 3 days before, and you got attacked for that comment. But now the fan base hear it from somebody else, direct from the horse's mouth in this case, and they're perfectly happy just to accept it verbatim. And I think, again, that's the sort of toxicity and the backdrop that the fan base are quite happy to attack me for anything that comes out of my mouth. But when exactly the same words come out of the mouth of someone directly connected to this deal, they're quite happy to accept it. And very rarely do you get an apology.
Yeah. Okay.
You know what? Yeah, obviously you made some good points, and initially you made the point about the fact that Ashley came out and spoke openly, and it's not really something that you would expect him to do. The same with Amanda Staveley recently. But do you not think that after you know what, 15, 16 months of being in this situation, that they as a club, so Mike Ashley as the club, and Staveley as the consortium, do you not think that they've now had to resort to other ways in which to gain sort of this attention and bring this to a head, because of how many months they've gone through this process without getting anywhere? Do you not think that, you know, that's certainly my opinion, is that I do believe that a lot of this is not normal behavior by the individuals, but I feel that it's behaviors that they've had to go to in order to, you know, strategically ensure that they're in a fighting position to get this takeover through. I mean, because you've talked about, you know, it is as cut as dry as arbitration. They're either separated or they're not. We either get the takeover or we don't. And you are right in that point. But because it's gone on for so long, you know, do you not understand from their point of view that they've had to work in this way in order to get where they are right now?
I think that's a very fair perspective, and I'll answer it in a moment. But first, I have a question for you, Pete. I see a Newcastle shirt, but I hear a Leicester accent.
Yes. I tell you, who said this lad wasn't a good journalist? Look at that. He's been on the show 15 minutes and he's sussed you out already, lad.
Yeah. Why there's not King Power shirts to match the Leicester accent, but we'll find out that a little bit later. I'll have to do some digging as to why you're a Newcastle fan. But coming back to your question, I think a lot of fans ask me exactly the same thing, that you can't look at this and expect Newcastle United or even the consortium, who are not directly involved in the court case in terms of their name anyway, but of course they're inputting and being kept abreast. You can't expect any of them to remain consistent in how they act, because eventually you lose your patience. And obviously the consortium lost their patience once and they officially withdrew, and now a lot more time has passed. They've determined that arbitration is the best path. And then if that's dragging on and they're not getting any progress, then of course they might change their tact. And I fully appreciate that view. And at the same time, you can argue at the flip side that they might just feel that they're not going to win, or that it's a 50-50 call, and then they're trying to exert pressure. Because remember that Newcastle United have got absolutely nothing to lose, knowing that arbitration won't be public, saying that they want it public, because that's strong messaging. And then if it stays private and they were to lose arbitration, they've set it up that there's somehow a corruption backdrop. And again, they might be right, but they can just tactically create that scenario, and it helps them even if they lose. And similarly, if arbitration ends up somehow last minute going public, then Newcastle appear to have fought for that, and win or lose, again, the messaging is strong. The club look like they're fighting for the takeover and also listening to fans. So all of that kind of side of things is quite intriguing, because you've kind of got the tactics and the reality. And the tactics we can second guess, but the reality we won't know unless everything is made transparent. But from the Premier League's perspective, let's say arbitration went public, then if they win, you're still going to get allegations of corruption. And if they lose, then they're exposing their entire business, even though arbitration is on a really specific point. If they lose, there's going to be a media circus, there's going to be brand damage, and then who knows what kind of follow-ons, because even if the conduct aspect is not touched upon in arbitration, if you lose over separation, there's going to be a whole war cry around "we told you so," around what else are they hiding. So I can understand why they want to keep it private. And part of the reason they want to keep it private is also because no litigation outcome is certain. Whereas for Newcastle, if no litigation outcome is certain, if they win, they want that public. And if they lose, they want it public so they can come back to the fact that there's somehow corruption. But from the Premier League's point of view, if they win, they still don't want it playing out in public, because there is that brand damage and there is that media circus. And if they lose, they certainly don't want it being played out in public. But I think in terms of why Newcastle have changed their tact, which is coming back to your original point, maybe they've got frustrated. Maybe they just realize that there's avenues now legally where they can update fans through. Maybe they're bracing the kind of public messaging because they know that disclosure's coming through the anti-competition case. So they're kind of slowly weaving a narrative. It's obvious that they'll have sought legal advice before going public. So it will be a sensible tactic. But the thing we don't know is whether it's a tactic out of desperation and to kind of get the fan base on side and almost have a sort of last throw of the dice outside of the normal avenues. So when Staveley goes to Tracy Crouch and then Tracy Crouch replies, well, this isn't my remit. I'm working unpaid in this area. There's nothing I can do. That felt more like a tactic, and it felt more like a move just to kind of push the agenda into spheres outside of the standard legal court. And to me, desperation was my gut instinct on that, but I fully respect anyone that says the opposite, that it's just the consortium weaving in a narrative because they're that confident about winning, and you can look at it both ways. But it is very odd to me, talking to lawyers, talking to both sides, speaking to sources, because it's been so covert, it's been so private. Newcastle United are the opposite of transparency in all other areas, and suddenly a few days before the hearing, everything's being put out there in media to MPs. The statement asked fans to war cry and write to their local MPs and so on. And I get it, but it's activism. It's almost lobbying. And my worry for those that want the takeover, and it is only my perspective, is just that if you're being that active and making such a large noise in all of these tangential spheres to the actual hearing itself, then that might suggest that you're not as confident behind closed doors of just winning that one key point. And let's not forget that key point again, is or isn't PIF part of the Saudi state? And if the answer to that question is no, they are separate, in my opinion, having spoken to sources on both sides, a takeover will happen. So for me, Newcastle United's focus should be private and solely on that.
Okay. One quick question then, just to follow on from that, because I know Chris has got questions and so has Daz, and we do still want to talk about some other stuff as well in a while. Would the information that you've seen or you've been heard, you've been privy to, would you say, not necessarily whether one side wins or the other, but do you believe that there is enough there to show that PIF are separate, or do you believe, or do you think, or from what you've heard, that they are closer entwined, I suppose, is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think before I answer it, it's really important to stress one thing, which is that proving PIF are separate from the Saudi state is virtually impossible. And to do so, you would need bodies and lawyers and ultimately transparency from within the organization far beyond this case and this context. Okay. But before everyone shouts at me, particularly those listening, Newcastle United don't have to prove conclusively, definitively that PIF are separate from the Saudi Arabian state. And that's the key point. Newcastle United need to prove that in this specific context, there is enough layers of separation from the different members of the consortium, from the holding company that is UK registered, from the club itself, to PIF, to the Saudi state. And if we talk too broadly about proving separation, you won't even find pro-Saudi journalists that live in Riyadh that can tell you for sure, because the whole country is divided. Of course, Mohammed bin Salman, who runs PIF and is the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, has a huge amount of influence. The board is royally decreed. People forget that when the bid came in for Newcastle at exactly the same time, PIF were given billions and billions of money to make, quote, opportunistic COVID purchases from the Saudi Central Bank. And the Saudi Central Bank is the government bank. So if we're just talking about the wider picture, then it is absolutely abundantly clear that a .gov website run by the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, with a board full of ministers and funds from the Saudi Arabian government, are influenced by, guess what, the Saudi Arabian state. But actually, that doesn't matter. What matters is, could Newcastle United specifically be influenced by the Saudi Arabian state, or are there enough layers of separation? PIF's legal classification matters to some extent, albeit that the proof for that comes from a document from the Saudi Royal Court. So effectively, you've got PIF and Mohammed bin Salman asking the court to clarify the separation. They provide a letter. That letter doesn't really hold up outside of Saudi Arabia because it's just written on request. But again, it might be factored in. And obviously, we know that Newcastle have got a very good Middle East-based lawyer with excellent knowledge of Saudi Arabia and the structure. But what matters is not all of that. What matters is essentially, and this is almost a better way of putting it, is the Premier League's owners and directors test robust enough and specific enough in its semantics to factor in the Saudi Arabian state? In other words, are the definitions of, quote, control and director specific enough, robust enough, and can they logically be tied back to that wider picture that I've just mentioned? And the honest truth is probably no. And that's the sort of irony here, that when you look at the practical reality, a purchase by PIF for Newcastle United could potentially be very dangerous, both to Newcastle United and the Premier League's brand, because Mohammed bin Salman has proven, regardless of what the rule book says, that when he wants to intervene, he will. And yet, why would he intervene negatively for Newcastle United? The only logic is maybe if they're not succeeding, or if he ends up wanting to buy another club, Newcastle United could kind of get shrugged aside. But you see that with lots of ownership groups fundamentally. Yeah. And then there's the sports washing side as well. But I think that's probably within the business plan anyway. There's going to be a lot of visit Saudi Arabia messaging and tourism kind of promotion and soft power and all of that. But that's no reason to fail the test. You know, we might not like sports washing, but there's nothing illegal or criminal or worrying about it. It doesn't touch upon things like financial mismanagement. So to sort of summarize and answer your question, the reason why we don't know who's going to win, other than the fact it's confidential and behind closed doors, is because what we see from the outside in is how worryingly intertwined PIF and the Saudi Arabian state are. But what we don't see or know is how the semantics of the owners and directors test will be interpreted. And I actually think that when you have three different members of the consortium, albeit with different weights of influence, and when you have the holding company and the football club, and ultimately those that are appointed to Newcastle United, and then up to PIF, and then up to the Saudi Arabian state, that is a lot of layers of separation. There's plenty of scrutiny. There's plenty of opportunity to try ultimately and stop any undue influence. But the worry is still, in practical terms, the Premier League are right to say, well, number one, if you have Yasser Al-Rumayyan as your chairman, and he's a close aide of Mohammed bin Salman, and one day Mohammed bin Salman says, do this, do that, which goes against what the club want, which goes against the rules of the Premier League, how ultimately do you then hold the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia to account? And because the Premier League have had this problem already, and they believe the Saudi Arabian state were behind piracy, and they believe the Saudi Arabian state blocked them taking any civil action in Saudi Arabia, they've sort of had a taster of how difficult it is to actually hold the Saudi Arabian state to account on a different issue. And they've also seen how that Saudi Arabian state can filter into sport and can ultimately deface their brand. So piracy, therefore, is still very relevant to all of this. But again, it's not going to come down necessarily to the bigger picture. I think it's going to come down to very specific legal arguments around the semantics of the test. And we know already that the Premier League's owners and directors test over many years, even though it's evolved, isn't necessarily robust enough because it's a reactive.
Yeah.
It means that when a new ownership comes in and afterwards there ends up being an alarm bell, the test changes to react to that alarm bell. And because they didn't anticipate this particular ownership group in advance, I'm not entirely sure that the wording will be robust enough to allow the Premier League to make that connection between state and PIF. But ultimately, we have to wait and see.
Yeah, we'll let it run. Okay. Chris, lads, any other? We are getting loads of questions. Looks like we've got some plenty of people that know their differences between legal entities and other.
We can do a speed round.
Yeah, we could do a speed round. Chris, Daz, any questions for this gentleman here?
I've got a cracking question for Ben here, and I wanted to ask you this as well, Ben. So our good friend Geordie's asking, do you fancy coming to our protest for transparency on the 16th of July in London?
I mean, I'm for transparency. I'm for turning up to anything that Newcastle United fans do. So absolutely. And again, it's always good when you can talk and meet people in person, because then you can have a proper conversation where you're not limited to 256 characters. But I think with the protests, it's still really important to have that focus, because what 99% of Newcastle fans are doing is rightly voicing their concerns and at times lobbying and protesting. And that's great. Everyone's entitled to an opinion. But we can't get sucked into this mob mentality where everyone protesting is really protesting on quite a broad point, which is, one, an assumption the Premier League are just corrupt, two, an assumption that PIF in particular and the consortium at large are just an amazing thing for Newcastle United Football Club, and three, that Mike Ashley is somehow now heroically fighting for both transparency and the takeover. And all of those things may be true, but obviously we don't actually have the information to definitively say that. And therefore, when a protest happens, it's important to try and make it as productive and practical as possible, educating around the facts, trying to involve those who actually are part of the process. And it may be in a protest that there can be a sort of solidarity element where Staveley or somebody connected to the club or the consortium turns up, because obviously that adds credibility and validity. So even if they can't say anything or confirm a perspective, if they're choosing to endorse a process, then it ultimately suggests, to some extent anyway, that they implicitly agree with the message of that process and protest. So you could sort of jump to a conclusion that part of that messaging is shared by those that are fighting behind closed doors. But obviously, if there's just a protest and it's against toxicity, it's against limbo, it's against Steve Bruce, it's against Mike Ashley, it's against a lack of transparency, all you're going to get is a kind of mob shouting, "Masters out, Qatar stooges," and so on. And it just becomes kind of mudslinging before the fact. And we need to get out of this mentality where everybody is so staunchly of one extreme opinion before we've let the legal cases play out. So I'm happy to come down. I'm happy to talk to fans. I'm not going to be coming down with a sign for or against. I'm a journalist and I would cover it as such, with balance and with respect. But again, I can't underline enough that if people are to assume that this is all one-sided, and they're perfectly entitled for that, they also need to have the patience to let it play out and then come and say, "I told you so." So right now, pushing for, let's say, just the hearing happening in public, absolutely fine. Pushing for the Premier League to be more transparent, broadly speaking, off the back of the European Super League fiasco, absolutely fine, albeit it's more the clubs than the Premier League in that particular case. But what kind of struck me about Staveley was that she specifically said we need, quote, "an immediate intervention." And what struck me about Newcastle's statement was it specifically said, go off and lobby your local MPs, your media, and so on. And again, that all sounds good, and it certainly galvanizes a weight of voices that they're presumably hoping makes the Premier League or the government act and change their mind and push for public, in inverted commas, and transparency. And I have absolutely no issue with that. But the irony of it all is that when Staveley said immediate intervention, the club have got two immediate interventions, and legal cases do just take time. Arbitration hasn't taken much longer than it normally would, and would be done, let's not forget, if Newcastle United hadn't added 5 months onto the process by appealing the panel chair. And again, people will be listening and saying, well, the Premier League have delayed as well. But we don't actually have any physical proof of that, other than that one letter that talked about the marching up and down the hill. But that was about messaging. That was about actually delaying government departments from giving them the information, because there was no clarity as to when an announcement would be given or not. And if it's proven the opposite, that actually that messaging was about stringing Newcastle United along, then I'll come back on and I'll hold my hands up. But it doesn't appear that that was the case. So we have to be very careful here, because the fan base is slowly becoming more, I don't want to say toxic, because I do agree with you that it's just a vocal minority, but it's building and it's snowballing. And we have to be really careful that we don't hit a scenario where everybody thinks that their voice is what's going to exert pressure whilst at the same time turning things ugly, because it's the only possible intervention. Because that's not a true narrative. Newcastle United have got two interventions. They've got the arbitration and they've got the anti-competition case. And what more do you want at this stage? You've got intervention number one, a legal case to prove separation that should lead to a direct pathway to a takeover. And then you've got intervention number 2, which is framed around corruption and transparency and damages and anti-competition. And I just don't see what else anybody wants, because it can't be resolved directly through the government. It can't be resolved directly through fan interaction with the club, fan interaction with the consortium. All that can happen here is that kind of lobbying might cause some pressure on the arbitration. Long shot, highly unlikely to be public, or it might have a bearing on the anti-competition case if that runs its course. And that's great. But again, it doesn't matter regarding the next step, because public or private, fan voice or no fan voice, protest or no protest, the hearing's going to happen. It's 99.9% going to be a private hearing. And if Newcastle win it, they will, as I understand it, 99.9% get their takeover. So great to protest. It's a passionate fan base, but let's not get sucked into the stuff that isn't relevant. Let's also have some patience and just wait and see how this plays out, because if it plays out in Newcastle's favour, a lot of the current frustrations and gripes won't really matter.
I think, I think you know, you've made a good point with you know, referred to, I think, as noise with regards to, you know, creating all the noise with regards to the fans and getting the fans on their side and getting them to, you know, the protest is one of them, and getting them to write to their local MPs and all the rest of it. But I feel like, and I know this is not just my opinion, but other Newcastle fans that I spoke to feel the same, is that we're at the point now where, you know, and I think Amanda Staveley mentioned this, it might have been in the ITV Time Tees interview, in that they just want to have a fair crack at the whip. And they didn't feel earlier on, back in November, I think it was, where they asked for the chair to be removed, is that they didn't believe that they were in a fair position with the way it was standing. And you, for me personally, I'm inclined to understand where they're coming from, because the fact that they had to wait 17 weeks for an answer or non-answer, you know, they're in a position where they're finding it difficult to get any sort of leeway or any way through to finding what is actually happening. So I think at the crux now, right at the game point, right, where it means something, they're trying to get the fans on side to rally again. They're coming out in their droves, and you know, you got statements, you got interviews, and I think they just want it to be in the media, so the media are aware of it, so the media are reporting on it, because they want to know that when they go into that arbitration, whenever it starts, is that they know that those people that make these decisions, these big decisions that are going to effectively decide the future of our club, that they understand what is on the line here, and they want them to do their job properly, and they don't want them to be influenced anyway towards the Premier League, because the Premier League are a big influence. They're a huge, you know, single entity in terms of world football. So that is an influence in itself, but they want a fair crack at the whip. And I honestly believe that that's why they're doing it. Do I believe that it's going to be out in the public? No. Do I believe that Amanda Staveley and the consortium and the club believe it's going to be out in the public? I don't believe that either. But I think they're trying to get their message out so that it's fair game going into that arbitration. So, you know, that's just my opinion on the situation. But I think, you know, the noise that you're mentioning, I think, is right. I think you've made a really good point with regards to the protest too. I have some reservations with regards to the protest in terms of it being meaningful. I don't disagree with it. I think it's a great idea, but I want it to be meaningful. I want it to have a direction. And like you said yourself, Ben, in terms of it going in different directions and people, you know, with the mudslinging and having different agendas by turning up on the day, you want it to be a collective. You want it to be a collective understanding that they are there for the same reason. But as I mean, you know, from a protest point of view, you know, have the police been informed? Is it safe? You know, are they not just going to get moved on by the police on the day because they've not done things properly? I have questions about all those things and whether they've been looked at. Maybe they have, I don't know. But we want that protest to be as successful and as meaningful as possible. So we just want to make sure that they've gone through all the right processes to make sure that on the day it is spot on and it's there for the right reason. So when the media coverage is there, it's not going to get picked out and pulled in a direction that's going to be completely thrown in negativity. We've already seen today with regards to the banner over the stadium and the Newcastle fans not being happy with that, and I'm inclined to agree. And I think it's been taken away now as an option.
Changed, yeah.
They've changed it, and rightly so, because Sunday is about, and I'm sure we'll get onto that in a second. Is about England and winning the European Championships, not about an agenda with Newcastle. That's separate. That can be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week. It doesn't need to be on that Sunday. But I think you made some really good points, Ben, and I hope that one or two from the protest group are listening, because I think we need to make sure that it's a collective effort, but things are done properly and everything's been thought of, and it's not just a turn up on the day and see what happens. There's an actual aim to what we're actually trying to do.
Yeah.
Just on that, Pete.
No,
I just want to say that no, we've kind of got an exclusive there, a bit of breaking news. I suppose you could say that in regards to the protest, that Ben has confirmed that Ben is in. He's not out for the protest. So that's good. That's good. Thanks.
I'll turn up on my left chair. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. Obviously, I know people are commenting, and we might not get to all of the questions, but I saw the comment from Kirk, who said that the delay for the arbitration chairman was down to the fact the Premier League didn't reveal a link between the chair and the Premier League, and that's absolutely correct. So when you say the consortium had every right to contest it, as I said at the time, that is 100% correct. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that arbitration and any legal case takes time. Even a so-called quick or expedited case could take 6 months to a year. So it's not about whether Newcastle were right or wrong to question Beloff. The irony with Beloff, of course, is that he's worked many times through Blackstone Chambers with Nick DeMarco. So I'm sure that Nick himself very much respects Beloff and has no personal problem with him. But it's less about were they or weren't they valid in delaying. It was more just to emphasize that it was a delay. So when people make a blanket claim of it's taken well over a year, why wasn't it sorted instantly? How has it not been done by the new season? It's just important to accept that 5 months of the delay was Newcastle United. Yes, there might have been Premier League delays as well. And yes, Newcastle United's delay is very much a valid approach. So no one's saying they shouldn't have delayed it. It was a normal, natural delay based upon their need to, in their opinion, change the chair panel to give themselves the best opportunity of winning the case. But it still added time. So that was really my main point there. And then I think, Pete, you made a great point about how it's becoming about the consortium having their voice out there and updating fans and allowing fans to be part of the process and trying to push for transparency. And, I know I sort of half joked before that Newcastle are the least transparent club in the world, but that's nothing to do with this ownership group. So you can't kind of have them be judged by the same historical standards as Mike Ashley. Maybe what they're also doing is preempting a takeover and wanting to show that even before they came into the football club, they were trying to be as open and as honest as possible. And then once Mike Ashley leaves, they might even privately accept that the club needed that change of transparency internally as well. Of course, they're not going to go so far as to say that right now, that we're updating you because the club never update you and we want to change that culture. But if they actually end up assuming control, that could be one of the first things that they say. So I completely agree with you. I think that's an excellent point. I think the only thing I would add briefly is just that we've inadvertently, in this narrative, tied a lack of transparency and, in inverted commas, corruption to arbitration. And once again, arbitration is not significantly about that. Arbitration is an agreed terms of reference, which are out there through legal paperwork that we've already seen, that state the remit can and is only going to be whether or not PIF are separate from the Saudi Arabian state. Now, if the case was public, we might see aspects that show delays. We might show aspects that show a lack of conduct, but they're not really going to be factored in, because whether the Premier League delayed or whether they didn't, whether the Premier League wanted the takeover or didn't want the takeover. I don't see how that's factored into this specific terms of reference, because if the Premier League don't want the takeover, but then they legally argue that there's no separation and that's why they didn't want the takeover, whether or not they had the right to take that opinion and start with the premise that they wanted to not green light it, as long as legally they can prove that there's a lack of separation, the ball returns to the consortium's court. And let's not forget again that the consortium can return even if they lose arbitration, as long as they then list the Saudi Arabian state as a shadow director. But they obviously won't, because I think they're aware that not only would that create bad publicity, but they would in all likelihood fail the test as soon as Mohammed bin Salman and piracy can be factored in. But that's another important point, that if the Premier League were to win arbitration, Newcastle United could accept the result of arbitration, and then they could be retested, having listed both PIF and the Saudi Arabian state. And sometimes I think that people forget that particular point. But I think that what I always try and emphasize is, if, as we understand it, arbitration is that specific, then all of these protests and all of this feeling of a lack of transparency on the Premier League's part might be true, by the way, and might be something to pursue. And if they pursue to the extreme, could result in a change of governance, could result in government intervention, could result in a rolling of heads. But it's much more so the anti-competition case. And I don't think it's as relevant to the arbitration. So people kind of thinking that the protest will directly make the arbitration public and expose the Premier League's delays and lack of integrity almost, I think actually it won't go that far because of how specific arbitration is.
Okay. I think, sorry, Pete, I was just going to say, I think, you can look at it from many angles, and I think Ben's put some really great points across. We've had some good questions, but I think at the end of the day, for me, I actually see it quite simplistic, which is, at this stage, as it currently is, it's with the legals, and there's nothing else at this stage that really matters. Would be my view. So I think it just it does just have to unfortunately play out. And while we've waited for however long, for me, whatever does come out of this, I'm kind of at the stage now where all I want is an answer. I just want to know one way or the other, and I think that's the bigger crux. Now, I am conscious of time, Pete, and I know you were going to jump in there. I'm conscious of having Ben, and
I've got a tiny question for Ben as well. Tiny one, but it'll be quick.
We've still got to get to Leicester and England.
I just want to ask. Okay,
if we run over, it's not my fault.
Sorry. I just want to ask: do you, in your opinion, do you agree? Do you believe that the Premier League just didn't want to make this decision? And obviously, their working relationship with BN Sports is quite big. We know in terms of the Qatari and the Saudi Arabians, in that point, this time last year, their relationship wasn't as strong as it is now. Do you think that there is a possibility that they just didn't want to, as the Premier League didn't want to make the decision, and arbitration making the decision for them literally takes their hand away, and that they don't have to make that decision, so it's not then falling on them? What do you believe that there's, or do you feel that there's a possibility that could be the case?
I mean, there's obviously a possibility, if you play into the lack of conduct or corruption argument, that the Premier League started not wanting the takeover, delayed it, forced the consortium out on purpose, offered arbitration, as they had to, by the way, in the process, which people often forget. But at the last possible moment, the consortium withdrew, they sought legal advice, they came back, and then they retabled arbitration from a more confident perspective. And now, since then, the process has played out as such. That's one theory. I think it's more likely that the Premier League didn't know how to make a decision, and as a consequence had no idea who to test in the first place. So it's such a complicated takeover, and Richard Masters said that very early on, long before there was quite so much negativity, that this is the most complex takeover that the Premier League have ever had to consider. And naturally, piracy was a factor, and not just because of beIN Sports specifically. And I know a lot of people watching will say beIN Sports lobbied and the anti-competition case will prove that, and they influenced the Premier League. But when you look at the backstory, and remember, I worked and lived in the Middle East, and one thing I did for 6 months as an investigative journalist was write a 7,000-word piece specifically on Be Out Q, going to Saudi Arabia, getting a box, looking at the frequencies, talking to the Saudi Arabian government, and of course talking to beIN Sports as well. And what was apparent from all of that was the Premier League also commissioned their own report separate to beIN Sports. The Premier League formulated their own opinion on Be Out Q, and the Premier League tried 7 times in Saudi Arabia to take civil action against specifically the Saudi Arabian government, and no law firm would take their case. So therefore, the Premier League started for sure with a predisposition about the Saudi Arabian state who they believe stole their rights. I'm 100% convinced of that. So then the key question is, were the Premier League genuine in tying PIF back to that Saudi Arabian state? And you can certainly make that argument because, as I said before, you're looking at a .gov website with government ministers and who runs PIF, Mohammed bin Salman. So that's one argument, in which case the Premier League were put in a very difficult position because 2 different issues had intertwined: a Newcastle United takeover from Saudi Arabia and Be Out Q and piracy, both of which can be linked back in the Premier League's eyes to the Saudi Arabian state. But how can they show that? How can they prove that? How can they do the due diligence around it? Are they correct in their opinion? What legal advice do they have to take? What's the counter argument? So that to me suggests kind of confusion and a lack of clarity and no idea who to test. And then even perhaps when they established who they could or couldn't test, is the wording of their test even robust enough to allow them to take the route that they wanted to take? So that's kind of how I think it genuinely played out. I don't think it's quite as extreme as the Premier League just going no, but I don't think it's quite as simple as the Premier League kind of acting in a way that was almost predetermined or defined. I think it's sort of more about it just being very complex and the Premier League being very conscious of who ultimately founded PIF and who was on the PIF board, and perhaps not wanting to make a firm decision on either the test or just the course of action that they took before gaining that absolute clarity of what can we do and can't we do legally, and is our test going to back this up? And I do believe that the Premier League are well aware of the connection between PIF and the Saudi Arabian state, and that piracy is still at the back of their mind. But I also believe that they have to follow their own test. And that's what this legal case is kind of now all about. So to sort of answer your question, Pete, yeah, of course, there's a theory that just says they just didn't want to do business with Saudi Arabia because of the backdrop of piracy. They realized that their test was not good enough to just take that route. And as a consequence, they delayed and forced the consortium out. And if somebody says that theory to me, I certainly can't deny it. It's a logical theory. But as a journalist, where's the proof? And obviously fans now will scream, well, the proof's behind closed doors. That's exactly why we're calling for transparency. So if you want to take that side of things, then I respect that. But my understanding, and as a journalist, I'm talking to both sides and I'm speaking to sources, is that the Premier League were more in a position where they genuinely needed clarity on the relationship between PIF and the Saudi Arabian state, and they were prepared to give Newcastle United and the consortium a fair crack to prove that separation. And then, of course, they chose not to take the arbitration, and now they've decided to pursue the arbitration. So we're sort of back where we started. And I think that in some senses, it doesn't actually matter which extreme you take, because some people listening will hear me and say, you're always defending the Premier League. You're basically saying they just didn't know who to test. They were honest. They were trying to do a very complex takeover, and they were trying to implement their test the best way they could, but they couldn't take the next steps because there was no clarity on who to test, and you can't test unless you know who to test. And people will listen to that and say, God, that Ben Jacobs, he's a Premier League spokesperson. And then the other extreme I've already outlined, which is the complete opposite. And that's more about the Premier League not showing a lack of conduct and not wanting the takeover to happen. But actually, we get too caught up in those two conflicting narratives, and neither of them matter, because both sides have agreed to go into arbitration. They've accepted the terms of reference, and they've allowed an independent panel to decide. And because the consortium are still at the table, and because Newcastle United have stayed up, thankfully, not much has actually been impacted yet. We're back where we started. We've got an independent panel making the decision. Newcastle have appointed someone, the Premier League have appointed somebody, and Newcastle will now have to abide behind a very experienced chair in Beloff. So again, I know it sounds very simplistic after a long rambly answer, but let the hearing play out, because if it plays out in Newcastle's favour, then a takeover will happen.
Okay, cool.
Ben, I just had a dead quick question for you, mate, and I promise it's not a long one. A lot of people have asked this on the chat as well, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well. So I just wanted to know, from a gut instinct, based on what having, had communications with both sides, obviously, the knowledge that you've got and what you've read into, what you've looked into, what you've heard, just a summary of, how do you see this panning out in your gut feeling? Not even necessarily how it will in terms of, what the outcome will be, but more what you think the decision will be. Do you think we'll get this takeover in any means, or do you think that, chances are it won't happen? And again, here at Loathers, we're not going to hold you to that. We're not going to say Ben Jacobs said. I'm just interested to know, because obviously, from what you know and who you know, I'm just interested to hear, from like a neutral fan point of view, what do you think? What do you think's going to happen?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. It's the most asked question as well over the last year or so. And as a journalist, I can't give you an answer, unfortunately. So it's not a very interesting answer. And the reason for that is because we're at such a precarious stage. And I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to second guess litigation when litigation is always an uncertain outcome. And I know that sounds like a very vague answer, but it's the truth. And too often for clicks, we find the fan landscape, or even at times the media landscape, plunging to a definitive decision. But we all got burnt early on when we were told this was an imminent takeover, and there's that famous phrase, there were no red flags, and everyone went with that out of trust, because that's ultimately what the buying side were feeding to the media, and it turned out to be completely incorrect. And I think I was one of the first people, because I have contacts in the Middle East, and even from PIF, they were saying the same thing, that it's going to take time. Originally, they actually said to me, it's just because of Ramadan. And I put that out there. And then it turned out that there were genuine red flags and hurdles. And of course, now we're a year on and there's still no takeover. So as a journalist, I think it's really important, especially when I've got a fair few Newcastle followers now, not to be misleading. And even though it would only be my opinion, not to come out and tell you something that I don't believe to be true or don't believe to be accurate. And as things stand at the moment, I would even go so far as to say it is impossible to know which way this is going to go. So if you look at it from the Premier League's point of view, they're arguing what they've always argued, which is that the reality, regardless of what a bit of legal paper says, is that there is no separation. And in addition to that, the definition within their test of control and director is robust enough to allow them to factor in the wider Saudi Arabian state. And then Newcastle have got a Middle Eastern expert who knows Saudi Arabia well, and the so-called Lionel Messi of law, who has been dropping clues through his bread baking and hashtags for the best part of a year. And, it's great to have somebody of that reputation, and clearly Newcastle are well represented legally. But guess what? Nick DeMarco loses cases as well, including the appeal against the panel chair. So we can't look at this in football terms and say Nick DeMarco is our team as a Newcastle fan, and we're blindly going to believe that he's just going to win. And to sort of try and give you a bit more specifics, so I'm not only sitting on the fence, although I think that's the correct and most accurate position at this point.
I was just going to say, with the Nick DeMarco bit, now you're definitely going to get people tweeting at you, Ben. That's what I'm going to say.
But Nick DeMarco and Newcastle United are not just going to be arguing about the relationship between the Saudi Arabian state and PIF. They're going to be talking about how broad the definitions of these words in the Premier League's own handbook are. And it isn't a very robust test. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if Newcastle United win on a semantic rather than a kind of smoking gun. And I think they've got a very good chance if the test isn't robust enough. And we've all read it, and the wording is relatively vague. So I do believe that Newcastle United have a strong chance. And another reason I believe Newcastle United have got a strong chance is because the consortium wouldn't have hung around for this long just to argue over separation unless they thought they had a strong chance. But again, the Premier League will have counter arguments that we're not privy to, and they are, shock horror, confident as well. So when you've got two confident sides, it's like England-Italy in the Euros. You've got two confident sides, and the England fans think it's coming home and we've got home advantage, and the Italians think they're the best team in the tournament. And it's not too dissimilar to that. So I want to be able to tell you a gut reaction as to whether I think it's happening or not, but it's so finely balanced that I genuinely believe as a journalist it would be irresponsible to do that.
Okay,
Yeah,
That's fair enough, mate.
I was going to say that was a great answer, and also a very, very well played to Ben for a link in as we move on. Now, obviously, we are at 9 o'clock, Ben. I did only ask you for an hour. Are you okay to hang around for another 15 and we'll chat Leicester and England?
I mean, I can hang around for another 3 hours if we're chatting Leicester.
Okay, well, let's see how that goes. Pete might want to. So, you said there a finely balanced final on Sunday between Italy and England. So let's talk England. Obviously, last night, so far we've gone through the tournament, conceded only one goal, which was last night, which, by the way, was a blinder of a free kick. But playing as a team, Gareth seems to have them pulling together. Beat Denmark 2-1 last night. Harry Kane obviously slotting the penalty on the rebound. Some would say, certainly living where me and Daz live over in Ireland, although Daz is an Ireland supporter and I'm an England supporter, they would say it wasn't a penalty. And I've had numerous people and tweet
Very
me
soft.
and everything else today. And even somebody who sent me the TikTok of an Irish mother rapidly swearing at the TV when Harry Kane missed and then scored again. I do thank you for that. But what have you made of England so far, and where what's going to happen Sunday night, Ben?
I think specifically on the game, it was a composed performance rather than a clinical one, and they showed good maturity. They got the equaliser through Simon Kjær's own goal at exactly the right time. Maybe a different game if they'd have gone in 1-0 down at half time, but it was sort of obvious after about an hour that only one team was going to win the game, or of course it was going to go to penalties and be a torturous and frustrating evening for England. And it's a shame with the penalty, really, because it's taken away from the fact that overall England are one of the best two teams in this tournament, and the right two teams are in the final. I didn't personally think it was a penalty, and my two pet peeves, one legit and one a bit more far-fetched. Number one is let the referee look at that on the screen. Don't just allow VAR to communicate it, because it's so important. Let him see whether there's any contact, and at least then he can either stand by his decision or have a much closer look at it. And my more far-fetched pet peeve is I don't like the rule, even though it's legal, that allows the penalty taker, even after another player in Schmeichel has saved it, to follow up and tap the ball in. Because Kane is the big favourite to get that rebound. And of course, in this case, it's great because England won the game and got to the final. But if I'm taking off my England cap for a moment, Kane's starting ahead of everybody else in the box. If you miss the penalty, there should be an element of punishment regardless of what happens. And you shouldn't be able to continue the phase and just tap in a penalty. Somebody else from England could. So I don't love that aspect, if I'm honest. And when you combine the harsh penalty against Denmark with a Leicester keeper in Kasper Schmeichel making a fantastic save, he was lasered during the penalty. Kane's penalty was very, very poor. And then suddenly he gets an easy tap in and England go through. That's a shame because it becomes the talking point. But more broadly, England have been a pleasure to watch. They've been an absolute joy. They've got better as the tournament's gone on. Scotland was a little bit of a concern and they got booed off in that game at half time. But the squad rotation has worked. The likes of Phillips and Rice actually came in for criticism, but I thought he had a good game last night, and Saka, and we finally saw Sancho, and Grealish can still come off the bench, and Kane found goals, and the two best players for me really have, apart from maybe Raheem Sterling, have been Harry Maguire and Luke Shaw. And Shaw's had a breakthrough tournament, and I think now will leave this tournament not only with his head held high, even if England don't win the final, but with a much more respected reputation than he's previously had at Manchester United. And then in terms of what might happen in the final, I don't know what everyone else thinks, but home advantage can work both ways for England, because if they fall behind again, and as we saw against Scotland, the home crowd may just add to the cauldron and potentially even kind of enhance the stress aspect for England. But clearly that Wembley advantage before you kick off and in the early stages of the game is going to be massive for England. But I do think we're against a better team. I think if it was just on paper and if it was at a neutral venue, those Italians there, as we can see, are a little bit stronger than England. They're a bit more cohesive than England. Immobile and Insigne are going to cause all kinds of problems. So England's task really is to get the right selection, having rotated throughout the entire tournament. I don't think we'll see too many changes, to be fair, from the last game out. Maybe a back three again, like against Germany. But I think the other thing is just we've got to start stretching the slightly aging Italian centre-backs. And they're still world-class players, by the way. A lot of people like to just say that the Chiellinis and the Bonuccis of this world are kind of past it. Make no mistake, they're not. But with our movement and our versatility and our youngsters, we should be stretching them. And I think Spain did a really good job of that, even though they didn't end up going through. So it's going to be tight. It's going to be cagey. I don't necessarily think that England are the favourites for the final. But it's hard as an England fan not just to come out there and say, I think we'll do it, but only just.
Okay. Are you not on the fence there, Ben?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is one question we can't allow you to sit on the fence with. So Ben thinks in England. Chris, Daz, let's not ask Daz. Daz doesn't count. Pete, Chris, what do you think? Pete's definitely going to say it's coming home. But I think me personally, I think it'll be very, very tight. But I think, I'm not sure, but I think it was confirmed. Is the referee also English for the game?
Doubt it.
Yeah, apparently so.
Is it not Oliver? I thought it was Lee Oliver, is it not? Or whatever.
Michael
Oliver.
I don't know.
It's beyond keepers, isn't it? That was my understanding.
Okay, that's all right. I thought it's probably somebody just tweeting me stuff to get me going. Yeah. That's fine.
It couldn't be an Englishman. They wouldn't allow it.
To be fair, Queen Elizabeth was on VAR last night, according to one tweet I got sent today. So.
No, my understanding is beyond keepers, and then his assistants will also both be for the Netherlands. The fourth official is definitely Carlos del Cerro Grande. And then there might be some other VAR or reserve assistants that, who knows, is potential English blood. But it's a Dutch predominant team.
I wouldn't want Daz given out now after Sunday, if it does come home.
I want you to win, to tell you the truth. Yeah, I want England to win it. Because I backed them from the start. Of course I do. Yeah,
there you go.
Okay. From my pocket.
Chris, what do you think? What do you think? Is it coming home?
Do you know what, mate? It's a tough one. I've got to say it is a tough one. Part of me thinks it will, because everything's kind of fell our way. Certainly in terms of playing at Wembley so much, and I must admit, when that Denmark free kick went in, I was thinking, wow. I mean, it was some free kick, and I thought maybe this is the end. But then obviously the equaliser, and then England really pushed on and really deserved. It did deserve to go through last night, but I have got to say, I didn't think that was a penalty. And if that was given against us or against Newcastle, I would have been fuming. But it was given. It was tucked away eventually, and we did deserve to go through, because England really dominated towards the end of that game. And if we hadn't have gone through, it would have been bad. But yeah, I'm going to say England. I am going to say England, but I think it's going to be a far sterner test against Italy on Sunday.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, we've got about 5 or so minutes left. So let's. We did promise Ben we would talk about Leicester. So Pete, this is your neck of the woods, pal. So I'll let you lead this one, because you guys know more about Leicester than I do. I've been happy with the last hour of chat. So over to you, boys.
Right, Ben, what made you choose Leicester? Come on. Talk to us.
Made you choose Newcastle with the Leicester?
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why I support Newcastle. And it links into Leicester, actually. because the first ever game of football I watched properly was when Newcastle beat Leicester 7-1 to get promoted to the Premier League, or one of the last games of the season. Just by chance, I think it was on ITV, and I just switched on. I think my dad switched on by chance, and it was an absolute blitz of a first hole, and I just saw goal after goal, and I wondered who were this team in black and white, and it was Andy Cole in particular. He scored a hat-trick that day that really sort of stole the show for me. And he always had been one of my idols, and ever since that, I was just a Newcastle fan. And I was lucky enough that even at a young age, my brother, who was 5 years older than me, took me to games because I wanted to go, whether it was London, whether it was up north, whether it was anywhere in the country. And I was very, very fortunate at a young age to be able to go and experience some of the players, some of the quality players that we had around sort of, 93 onwards. It was great. So that's my reasoning. But come on, tell us about Leicester. What was it?
I mean, I was born in Leicester, and I'm a firm believer that you support your hometown club. And growing up, I'd come before I was born off that kind of golden generation at Leicester. I mean, many now will call the Premier League winning side the so-called golden generation. But, Leicester historically in the 80s had the Alan Smiths, the Gary Linekers, the Keith Wellers, the Frank Worthingtons in the 70s and 80s. And that was the generation that my dad grew up with. And he'd always had a season ticket at the old Filbert Street. And then, funnily enough, my dad is a dentist, and he used to treat some of the players. And one of the players he used to treat regularly was an ex-Leicester goalkeeper called Carl Muggleton. Yeah. And he came to Carl when I was probably only about 5, and used his connection, because it's always easy to ask something when someone's got their mouth wide open and a drill is inside, and they can hardly say no because you're a dentist with a drill. And he basically said, "Can my son be mascot?" And Carl was like, "I'll see what I can do." And the reserve team used to play regularly at Filbert Street at that time. And actually, they went on to win what was called the Pontins League. And on the last game of the season, they played Manchester United. And Manchester United could have also won the league. And it was a strange scenario where United actually brought their first team squad for a reserve game because they wanted to try and win the league. And Leicester beat them unbelievably, even though it was Leicester's reserves. So the reserves used to pull in probably 2,000 or 3,000 fans at that point. And after that game, I was able to arrange to be mascot. And it was a game against Notts County. And the Notts County captain at the time was Mark Draper, who went on to play for Aston Villa, of course. So down I went to Filbert Street, and I just remember kicking the ball about and scoring a goal and not even realizing the players were just letting me score the goal. And then I had the love for the club. And then from there on in, as I got older, I was a season ticket holder, and I followed the club through thick and thin. And I used to volunteer at BBC Radio Leicester when I was about 14 or 15 and make tea. And that was when I knew I wanted to be a football commentator. So Leicester's kind of always been ingrained in me. I used to like collecting all the different kits. I used to play for Oadby Owls, which is a team at Leicester that kind of feeds into the Leicester School of Excellence. Yeah. And I wasn't a bad left winger at one point. But the other overriding memory, I've told this story before, is, again, Newcastle United. And one of the reasons why, on occasion, I've posted a picture of me in the Newcastle Brown Ale kit is because Newcastle were my second team. So you and me, Pete, have kind of followed inverse paths, because Leicester's your second team, Newcastle's kind of my second team. And it was the game at Filbert Street where Newcastle came into it with a chance of going down, and Steve Walsh scored a late own goal, and the Newcastle fans erupted, and they were all in the shed end opposite the main stand at Filbert Street. And as a kid, I'd never seen that whole end filled with away fans, because normally it was just a very small section. And there was a pitch invasion, which I thought was incredibly cool as a young child. And the volume and the passion and the reaction of the Newcastle fans was incredible. And then the following season under Keegan, they won their first 10 games and they got promoted. So kind of that transition from a team that were floundering with that huge away fan base to them being top of the table and playing such attacking and entertaining football, it always also gave me a soft spot for Newcastle as well. The soft spot dissipated a bit when Leicester reached the Premier League and we kept losing at St James's Park, and that famous game where Shearer scored the late hat-trick and you beat us even though we were 3-1 up and it looked like we were going to win that game. And, you know, St James's Park was obviously always very difficult to win at in those days, and the away fans, as they are now, were up in the heavens. But, you know, those games against Newcastle were really special because I think everybody at that time, and this is one of the things that COVID's changed the landscape, Mike Ashley's changed the landscape over time. In those days under Keegan, you saw Newcastle United and you knew that you were going to see a performance for 90 minutes. You knew that you were going to see passion. You knew you were going to see a fan base that really made that stadium friendly and inclusive, but also claustrophobic. And it was very tough, therefore, as an away team to go to. And of course, even sides like Manchester United went to St James's Park and got hammered on occasion. We all remember that little Philippe Albert chip, one of the most famous goals in Newcastle's Premier League history. And I think that since those days, because stadiums are empty, because the fan base is a bit forlorn, because the team aren't performing as much, the passion's still there, but it's been placed in a different direction. And that same energy and that same love for the football club has become frustration, protest and hate, which is a great shame. And Leicester's the exact opposite. We went down into League One. There was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of protests against the former owner, Milan Mandaric. And then the new ownership have come in. And there's such an affinity, not just because of the unfortunate and tragic helicopter crash that took the life of Kunvishai, but even before that, there was such an affinity and respect between the young owner in particular, who was a more visible presence, and the late Kunvishai and the fan base. And it's like a fusion of cultures, and we celebrate the success together. But I also firmly believe that if things turn sour for Leicester, there won't be the same kind of reaction as we've seen at Newcastle United, because it's become almost a badge of how a club should be run, of how owners should interact with their fans, and of how the little guy can achieve a heck of a lot of success. And as a Leicester fan that's seen the dark years and wasn't born before the previous golden age, and now to watch us win the Premier League, to play in the Champions League, to challenge for Europe, even though we just missed out on the Champions League for 2 consecutive seasons, to be in Europe as a Leicester City fan, to have those away days, to return to the King Power Stadium and make so much noise with your loved ones next season, having missed them for so long, it's going to be absolutely incredible. And the only thing I can kind of compare it to, and I think it's the same probably for the semi-final against Denmark and also the final against Italy in the Euros, is the pre-match against Everton when we won the Premier League. And there was obviously the performance and the song and the lifting of the trophy. And it was just spine tingling. And I think that for different reasons now, football is spine tingling because people are joyous and excited by the small things they didn't even realize they missed. Sitting next to your father, your grandfather, taking your son and daughter to a game for the first time. And for a Leicester fan to do all of that, it's just wonderful and exciting. And I just hope that when Newcastle fans return to St James's Park, they don't forget the backdrop and the pandemic, and they don't go straight back into, we've still got Steve Bruce. Why haven't we signed who we want to sign? Is the takeover happening? Mike Ashley's still in the club. I really hope they just take one breath, even if it's just for one game, and say, wow, this is our home. This is St James's Park. This is our club. We're starting on 0 points, joint top. We stayed up last season. Let's just look around for a moment. And every time you smile at that person that sat 2 seats behind you, every time you see a young kid at their first game, every time you see someone next to you wearing the Newcastle United shirt, or even just walk past them in the street, I hope there's that like Leicester mentality of just giving them a smile and saying, isn't football brilliant? And then if after game 2 or even game 1, if you get beat, you want to go back to this kind of, the club's in disarray, the club's in limbo, the takeover's not going to happen, fine. But even though it matters, and even though I know that it is, in inverted commas, life and death to many people, it isn't actually life and death. COVID is life and death. And let's try, as the new season starts, and to sort of enjoy the raw, unbridled passion of football, whoever we support, and just smile and like it, whoever's in charge of your football club.
We're going to go at great points, Ben, as always. We're going to go into the signings in a second, but I just want to ask you just very, very quickly, and it's a really good point that you talked about. You talked about Mike Ashley as an owner. You talked about Milan Mandaric, who was a really, wasn't great by the end of it, and they were glad to get rid of him. The club was in a bad place in League One at the time. What was the turning point? Where did you see the club starting to turn, and becoming something different? Was there a particular point where you thought, right, we're going in the right direction here? What was it?
It was the opposite. There was point after point after point where, ironically, we were moving in the wrong direction. And then all I can put it down to is kind of luck and fate. And obviously, the Thai ownership group are very superstitious. So I suppose the turning point was that Milan Mandaric had no money and the new ownership group did. And let's not forget, they spent a lot of money to try and get out of the championship. And when you realize they've got that budget, you do feel like eventually your club is going to come out of the second tier of English football. And you also hope that as long as they manage that income correctly and within the rules, that you're going to have a well-managed club. But to summarize very briefly, the new ownership group came in. They went with managers like Sousa, who was short-lived and didn't work out. They spent money on Sven-Göran Eriksson, and it was a disaster. They brought back Nigel Pearson. And I suppose that was the point where you thought, yeah, the club are moving in the right direction. And we obviously had the crazy playoff against Watford with the Deeney goal after the missed penalty. And then we got promoted. And again, you thought, yeah. So that was the first turning point. But then you're in the Premier League and you're struggling. And for all love and money, you're down. And Leicester were bottom at Christmas and the Great Escape happened. And I suppose that was the second turning point, because the team realised that they were not living up to their talent, and they just found a couple of wins, and then suddenly the Mahrezes and the Vardys of this world kicked into gear, and players like Andy King. But then again, you can't really call that the turning point, because Nigel Pearson made a big protest after his son was sacked for off-field demeanours. That's the nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
If you Google it, you'll know a lot more about what actually happened. He protested that, he was sacked. And then the club brought in Claudio Ranieri, and myself included, much like the famous Gary Lineker reaction, said, what on earth? We've got no chance of doing anything with this Tinkerman in charge. And somehow the momentum of Pearson and that great escape bled into Ranieri. And then, of course, by succeeding and winning the Premier League, the club were then able to actually elevate. So it's sort of a mixture of quite bad lows and desperation, and then luck, and then success. And the success is clearly down to an incredibly talented group of players. But then what you're trying to do as a football club, and Newcastle will be the same, is use that success and that income and that additional everything, really, brand reputation. Leicester were invited to Hollywood after they won the Premier League, and all kinds of other places. So everything enables you to take a step up. You can expand your squad, you can expand your brand, you can expand your media department. And then you have to capitalize on that. So football for me is like very level driven. And if you look at the Leicester story and you just talk about it in levels, you have to get out of the Championship, and eventually we succeeded. You have to stay in the Premiership, and we succeeded, but only just. And then you kind of have a strategy that just tries to hover around mid-table and then move up into that top 8 or top 6. And these days, that's good enough for European football. But Leicester jumped about 3 levels. So actually, the turning point was in capitalizing on those 3 levels. How do you stay within the top 6, having gone from bottom to first? And, the likes historically of Blackburn Rovers and Ipswich Town and Leeds United, even when they spent big under David O'Leary, they were not able to do that. They had a couple of good seasons. Some got silverware, some finished in the top 2 or 3, which would have been good enough for Champions League back in the current football climate. But then they just fell. And I think the biggest testament to Leicester is that they've not fallen. And that, to me, is the sign of a good business.
Yep. And a good manager as well.
Obviously. And talking about your manager, and you mentioned good players, you've made some cracking signings this summer already. And I know Daz has got a few of them in waiting. So talk to us about this man, because you got Samir and you've got Ryan Bertrand as well, but in particular the first guy, because not a lot of people know about him, but he's come with huge potential. What do you expect from him? And did you know much about him before Brendan Rodgers brought him to the club?
Yeah, like a little bit about him. I mean, he joined from Red Bull Salzburg, and I had a very good relationship with the late Gerard Houllier, who unfortunately we lost this year. And Gerard was the director of football for Red Bull across all of those clubs. So I knew all about Patson Daka, and a number of clubs were looking at him, including Liverpool very early on in their recruitment. He's 22, signed a 5-year contract at the King Power Stadium, which already puts a lot of faith in him. And he's just got a really good backstory, to be honest with you. He used to play football in his national park over in Zambia. He was born in a mining town. He's kind of got that same mentality as like N'Golo Kante, in the sense that he likes to work hard. He'll be very humble. He'll be a big fan favorite. And I spoke to someone actually that used to watch him at his first ever club, the Cafu Celtics. And they said that he's an extremely vocal leader. He's very physical, but he's also quite a humorous character off the field. And it'll be really interesting to see how he fits into the Leicester squad, which is already full of big personalities. It can be hard when you're walking into a dressing room that has kind of quite Anglo-centric vocal personalities that have lived in Leicester for a while. The Wes Morgans, even though he's retired, the Mark Albrightons, even though he might go off to Burnley, I believe, the Kasper Schmeichel, even though he's not obviously English, he's been at the club for a while and he's almost got that kind of like English personality now. So I'd be really interested to see how he slots into that dressing room. But if you actually just look at him as a footballer, he did incredibly well over in Austria. He signed a 5-year contract with Red Bull Salzburg as well. That was only back in 2017. So they clearly didn't want to lose him. He was very good at the UEFA Under-19 Youth League tournament. He got a couple of goals in that game back in 2016, 2017, I believe. He represented Zambia at the African Cup of Nations for the under-20s, and he scored 4 goals, and he won the player of the tournament in that particular event as well. And then I think generally what we've seen at both international and club level is someone that is a natural goal scorer. And this is why he's going to go down really well with Leicester fans, because you look at Vardy and he's got pace and he knows where the goal is with his eyes shut. And you look at Mahrez when he played for Leicester, exactly the same. Cuts inside, takes a shot, knows where the corner of the goals are. So what Leicester have got is a huge prospect who's got pace, who's got an eye for goal, and because he's humble and because he's a leader, is over time going to become a big fan favourite.
Cool.
Well, the good news is we've got Joe Linton still next season, so that's also a positive for you.
Would you take Ayoze Perez back off us?
I would, yeah.
I wouldn't. I think we were very fortunate to get 30 million for him, Ben, if I'm honest. I don't get me wrong, as things stand right now, no takeover, I probably would. I'd take him back on loan. But if we were to get that takeover in a couple of weeks, I wouldn't even be looking at Ayoze Perez. I like him as a guy. I just think he's lacking something. I can't put my finger on it. I just think he's lacking something. Sorry, Pete, you were going to say something, mate.
No, I was going to sort of answer the question, because I was going to say exactly what you've said, Chris, in regards to Ayoze Perez. But obviously, living in Leicester, and I've been out watching the England games with all my mates that I grew up with, a lot of them who are Leicester fans, they have an opinion on Ayoze Perez. What's your opinion, Ben? Do you think he's got a chance of building a career at Leicester, or do you think he's going to move on?
I think he's been unfortunate in many respects. And I said the same about Cengiz Ünder, who's now left Leicester, that what we've seen from Perez is only flashes. He's not had a consistent run on the side. And almost Iheanacho's purple patch in the back end of the season has been a huge gain for Leicester, but a bit of a blow for Perez in terms of playing time. And he's kind of caught, I think, in his role now for Leicester and how he potentially interacts in the system, because Rodgers prefers that Vardy, Iheanacho, 2 relatively central, traditional front players. And I think that when Vardy was more of the focal point, Perez could kind of float behind him and have the opportunity to get wide and really run at defenders. And then suddenly his goal-scoring productivity wasn't under the microscope as much because he was playing more of an assist-based and versatile role for the team. And I think now I'm just not kind of that clear what he is in this team. And I remember when I first started watching Leicester, we had a player called James Scowcroft who joined Leicester and had a goal-scoring pedigree. And then at Leicester, he got moved into a wide player and he stopped scoring goals and he lost all of his confidence. And nobody was quite sure anymore whether James Scowcroft was a forward or an out-and-out striker, a hold-up player, a wide player, and so on, a false nine. And I think Perez is almost caught between the same. I can't define him anymore as a footballer. At Newcastle United, I knew what he was about. I knew his role in the team and he fit in the formation. And that's why I think that if he moves back, he might work quite well with the Callum Wilsons of this world. And potentially, if you get Willock back, even though it's a long shot, another good player to fit into that system. But at Leicester, I think he's too far down the pecking order. And unless he wants to be a bit part player, it wouldn't at all surprise me if he leaves the club.
Ben, I think we'll have to get you back when we take on Leicester.
I think we just need to have like the Pete and Ben show. We'll work
you know what?
We can do that.
I could talk to Ben about,
exactly, we can make it a regular thing.
About Leicester all day.
Because secretly you're a Leicester fan, that's why.
Exactly. That's not even his shirt.
Just to add into that, I do agree with what Pete just said there, because I don't know what it is about Leicester, but I just think they're a fantastically well-run club, as Martin said, fantastic manager in Rodgers. I think they're everything that we want to be, and I look at Leicester and think, great signings, fans behind them, great owners, and that's what we want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, you're bigger than Leicester. I think that's the final thing that I would say, that Leicester is the model of business to emulate, but it's not necessarily the model of brand to emulate from a Newcastle United perspective, because if you put the two on a level playing field in terms of investment or management, and, it took Leicester the best part of 10 years to get where they are now, and even that was fast forward. So if Newcastle go on a more normal pace, it still might take a new ownership group far longer than that, because not everyone's going to have the random Ranieri winning the Premier League. But for Newcastle United, you've got the stadium, you've got the fan base, you've got the passion, you've got the history, maybe a bit like Leicester compared to some clubs. It's just the location. By the way, Newcastle, wonderful city, but I'm talking about a player that knows nothing about England and is given the opportunity to play in London versus pretty much anywhere. They might pick London on occasion, but Newcastle, anyone that's been knows that it's one of the best cities in the world. So any player that does their research isn't going to be put off by a move to the city either. It's going to be part of the attraction. The wage bill wouldn't be a problem under new owners either. So Newcastle United, if they were hypothetically to follow the Leicester business model, would be 5 times bigger than Leicester City as a fan base and as a global brand and as a powerhouse in football. There's no denying that. And that's the kind of worry for Leicester, that well run now, but every time teams strengthen, there's new competition on the field, and there's already 7, 8, 9, 10 brands in the Premier League that, despite our success, are bigger than us and will probably always remain bigger than us. So if eventually the ownership group feel they've hit their peak, or if you have a few bad years, Leicester's the kind of club that can, unfortunately, yo-yo, much like many other clubs. Blackburn's a good example. I'm just going to say these two because it wins points with the fan base. Middlesbrough and Sunderland are good examples as well. So don't put Newcastle into that category. Newcastle are a big, big club.
I'm gonna literally cut that part of what you just said for the last 30 seconds, and I'm just gonna repeat that to my mates, my Leicester fan mates, on loop constantly, just as a reminder of where we sit.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm so glad you said that.
Bigger club.
I know Martin's going to wrap up now, but with regards to Leicester and more regarding the takeover, I think we all agree that we'd love to have you on again at some point down the line to discuss a little bit more as and when things break, and obviously talk a little bit more about Leicester, because I think we've only sort of scratched the surface.
Yeah,
we have. Yeah, exactly. Go on, Ben.
Okay, so I just want to say to anyone watching, thanks for watching. To like and comment, and make sure you subscribe to our channel, because we are growing. Been growing the last few weeks, but all the new subs help. So thanks for that, for anyone that has subscribed and stick with us. Also, I want to tell people what's happening tomorrow. We have Lee Lee from the Magpie channel. They're not Magpie channel. The NUFC in Newcastle Fans TV. Sorry about that.
Well,
yeah.
you get one piece to do. One piece.
No,
you haven't said hardly anything. You got one thing to do all evening,
Yeah,
and you mess it up.
I blame Chris's comment in the way. I was like, why is that comment still there? But yeah, so we'll have Lee on with us, and yeah, I can introduce him like that tomorrow. He'd love that. Yeah, that's coming up tomorrow. And also, Martin, give us a shout out to Bruce In.
Bruce In, yeah, the Bruce we do like. So Bruce and the team down in Centre Hill, right in the heart of Newcastle in Central Station, who will serve you up a selection of fine IPAs, pale ales, craft beers, distilled gins, and other local fancies, who have continued their sponsorship with us and looking after us. We do, I think, over the next couple of Loaded Mag shows, and we do need to organise a bit of a giveaway because Bruce has got a few bits for us to do either by post or locally. I'm not sure how he's going to send 12 bottles of gin in the post, but good luck to him. But yeah, thanks for their continued sponsorship. And yeah, look, that is it. I mean, I have to say, I am delighted. I know, I'm sure we will get comments and everything afterwards. Ben, absolutely delighted to have had you on. Thanks so much for coming on and sitting chatting with us. We did ask you for an hour. We've done an hour and a half, so thank you very much for hanging on with us. As Pete said, as things progress, I know you're a very, very busy man, but we will reach out again, and we would be honoured if you'd come back on again with us at some point and chat again.
Pleasure, guys. Keep up the good work. Enjoyed the last hour and a half. We've only overrun because of me. Everyone knows that I like to drink. I
know. I tell you, you and Pete are a fine pair.
But yeah, happy to come on again, guys, and stay safe. And come on, England.
Come on, England. Exactly. Thanks very much.
Cheers, Ben.
Let's wrap her up.
Lads.
Thanks
Bye.
very much for watching, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Guys.
Cheers,
bye.
Ben.
Bye-bye.